this is going to bring in experts from all over the world, from many different areas, all focusing on the issues related to globalization. The world is increasingly shrinking, or it certainly feels like that. And we are very honored to kick off this series with a great expert in this field, Dr. James Peacock. Dr. Peacock got his degrees from Duke and from this school they called Harvard, or how do you pronounce that? Is that right? Harvard? Okay, yeah, I'm not sure. You may have heard of it. And has gone on to do some incredible work on globalization around the world. And so please, if you would just take a second to welcome Dr. Peacock, we can get going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have all of you come. Any guesses of where or what this picture might be? Yes? You guessed. Great. And what or who do you think they might be?
Looks like Islamic people.
Yes, good guess. And what else? Well, they're women, and if you notice, they're sort of two. When we turn out the lights later, you can see it better. These are, there we go. These are members of, it's called Aisha, and it's the women's movement of Muhammadiyah. Muhammadiyah is one of the largest Muslim organizations in the world. It has 30 million people, 30 million. That's more than Baptists, for example. And so these are the women of Aisha, the women's movement. Right behind them is a photograph, which they took, of other women in the same place, Jogjakarta, but these are dancers in the court, and you may notice a difference in their clothing. Okay, well, I was asked to speak about global and local, so I thought I would start with a local example, and that is where we are, which is the U.S. South, even though you may think of yourself as the northern part of North Carolina and near the Virginia border, but more broadly, I think most people would think of all of North Carolina as being part of the U.S. South. So I'll focus on that first. But the main point I want to make is that the South is globalizing. So I'll give you a few observations, and I've outlined them already on the handout, and I've also outlined them on the board. And then later, we'll welcome your thoughts about that. First, a little bit of history, which I know Mr. Sattler specializes in, and some of you are studying. So this is a really simplified history about the U.S. South. And by the way, if I say U.S. South, I think of something like the area from the Rio Grande in Texas, El Paso, to the Potomac, northern Virginia, more or less the Confederacy. So the South had a global beginning in the 1600s, really even going back to the 1500s, coming of the Spaniards, when what we now call the South, and was then simply called the New World, had trade routes coming through the Caribbean and through Latin America to harbors like Charleston in South Carolina and Savannah in Georgia, and later Wilmington in North Carolina. And these ports, harbors, were very cosmopolitan, very global. In Charleston at the time, 50 languages were spoken. Back in the 1600s, 1700s, about a third of them were European languages, Spanish, French, German, English, and about a third were Native American languages, because there were, at that time, this was before the removal of many Native Americans to the West, and so there were many, many languages spoken by them. And then there were many African languages, because slaves had already arrived and brought with them their native language, Yoruba or others. So it was a global place. These were global places then. Then, in the late 1700s, as we all know, the USA became a nation. And as it became a nation, it began to differentiate into regions somewhat. So there was the South as one region, increasingly distinguished from the rest of the nation. That was partly because of slavery and the plantation system, which made the South somewhat distinct. And eventually, and by the way, before that point, people really did not speak about the South. The South was an invention in the early 1800s. Before that, they just thought of the New World and then the new nation, but not yet a region clearly distinguished. But starting about 1830, the South defined itself and was defined as a distinct region, and that eventually resulted in secession. You know all this. You've been taking these courses in history, much more detailed than what I'm telling you. And then with secession came the Civil War, and as you know, it resulted in about 600,000 military casualties and much destruction. And then Reconstruction followed. But despite Reconstruction, a sense of opposition between the North and the South endured, and even today endures somewhat. Do any of you know the organization called Sons of Confederate Veterans, for example? Maybe some of you are members. Many of us, including me, have ancestors who died in the Civil War, fighting for the South, perhaps, or maybe for the North. There were many counties in North Carolina where, especially in the mountains, where they did not secede, and some of the people fought for the North. Sometimes brothers would fight, one for the North, one for the South. So even today, there remains somewhat of a distinction and sense of opposition between North and South. And now you are mostly of a new generation, and it may not mean much to you at all. I think probably many of you are getting beyond that, but you can still see it here and there, and the Sons of Confederate Veterans is just one of the expressions of that identity. Okay, so that was through the 1800s, 1900s, 20th century. Now, 21st century, and globalization is taking off. How far it is getting depends on where you are, but it's everywhere in some degree. And I'll just give you a few examples, and I put some on the handout. Basically, immigrants. Huge numbers from Latin America. By the way, if you recently have been following these statistics, you know that as many Mexicans have gone home as had come, because jobs are not as plentiful here as they once were. But still, there are huge numbers of people from Latin America who have come to the USA, and actually the U.S. South is one of the leaders in that migration, partly because people come and work on the in agriculture and construction. Construction has diminished, and so many immigrants have gone home. But still, there are many, many who are here. And interestingly enough, if you happen to listen to the radio, they interviewed a person from Mexico, and he said, well, guess what? Many of the migrants who came to the USA had children, and they were schooled and reared in the USA, and so they speak English and not Spanish. So he said, we're going to have to install a bilingual education system in the equivalent of community colleges for all those children of immigrants who have now returned from places like North Carolina and have to now learn Spanish. Incidentally, I have a granddaughter who calls me abuelo. Her father is from Mexico. She says, abuelo. She's 3.5. She said, abuelo, you're very old. You're going to die. But meanwhile, you are available. And I think she's terrific. Isabella is her name. So, migrants, people came here. I'll give you one more example. I've mentioned Isabella, but later we'll turn to another place on the other side of the world, which is Indonesia. And one reason is because many years ago, my wife and I went there. And while we were there, we lived with an Indonesian family. The family was quite poor. We were living in a slum. They had 12 children. They could not support all of them, and so some of them they farmed out to other relatives, and one of those moved to North Carolina and now lives in Hillsborough and has a child who graduated from the North Carolina School of Science and Math, which, as you know, is an excellent school. So it's another example of immigrant success. So people who were far away sometimes are here now. And the reverse. Much of what we do and are has moved out into the world. And that ranges from Coca-Cola, one of the first global exports from the South, to blues and bluegrass, a lot of music, a lot of cultural exports, and then some people like Jimmy Carter, who created the Carter Center and does stuff all over the world. But Obama, whatever you think of him, is an interesting import, so to speak, because he grew up from age 6 to 10 in this place, Indonesia. So Obama is a kind of migrant to our nation. That's something that some people have pointed out, that he's not a native, strictly speaking, in some ways not. So there's been, in the global age, a lot of coming and going and mixing and mingling. And I think you all are aware of that very, very much. So what are the results? Well, I have 3 results that I want to mention. Dualism to pluralism is the most obvious, and the one that we've just discussed. Accelerated migration has resulted in more diversity in certain ways. Now, the simplest example I can give of that diversity is a joke, and maybe you've heard it. I heard it actually from a Hispanic who lives in Chatham County, which is next door to where I live. He said, one time, Jesse Helms and Jesse Jackson had an argument. Is God white or is he black? And then, and of course Jesse Helms actually did die. Jesse Jackson has not yet. But in this joke, they both died, and they go to heaven, and God greets them, and he says, "Buenos dias." So the point of my jokester, who is from Guatemala, from Latin America, is there's a new kid on the block, and that kid is Hispanic, but also maybe Asian or other things. And I know that you are familiar with that change in the South after a long period when most migration was into the North and the West and not to the South. But that's different now. Okay, so second result, maybe a new way of thinking about the nation and the world. We've mentioned opposition coming out of the experience of the Civil War and Reconstruction, where North was pitted against South and South against North. And even today, sometimes we think that way. So that, you know, people who come from the North are sometimes thought of as Yankees, and people who come from the South are thought of as whatever. There are lots of insulting words that you can use, rednecks or things like that. That's an old way of thinking. A new way of thinking would be something like this. Think how many people there are in the world. There are 7 billion. How many people are there in the USA, roughly? How many? Yeah, 300 million. 300 million is a pretty tiny fraction of 7 billion. So, therefore, the North and the South of the USA doesn't make much difference, you know, in a world perspective. Here these 7 billion people are, you know, a bunch of them are in China and India and other places, and then here we are as a nation, and it's pretty small. It's actually the 3rd largest, but that's after China and India. So here we are as a fairly small nation, and as a fairly small nation, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to emphasize the difference between different parts of our nation, like North and South. Maybe some other differences are very important, like the 99% and the 1%, you know, the very rich and the not so rich, and all those things. But from a global perspective, you might think that this oppositional attitude has diminished. Okay, has it? Well, let me give you an example, and you can sort of judge for yourself. A few years ago, we did a survey for the South. We telephoned 800 people who live all over the U.S. South. Deep South, Upper South, Middle South, rich, poor, women, men, black, white, Hispanic, young, old, you know, all the categories. And we asked those 800 people, do you think of yourself as a Southerner? 200 said no. They might have said hell no. But 601 said yes. And then we asked those who said yes, who identified themselves as Southern, to choose 2 kinds of identity. A, as a Southerner, I am connected to others around the world. As a Southerner, I am connected to others around the world. And then B, as a Southerner, I am different from other Americans. as a Southerner, I am different from other Americans. So one is more of a global identity, the other is more of an oppositional one. Okay, now let me ask you to predict how many think more of this 600 would have chosen or did choose the global identity. Wow, nobody thinks they would have chosen that. How many think of this 600 they would have they chose the oppositional or the regional identity? Okay, well guess what? You're wrong. Well, you're not wrong entirely, but here was the way the statistics came out. 29% chose the oppositional identity and 50% chose the global identity. And I'll tell you frankly, I was surprised, and I wonder, you know, you never know about statistics. You have to take them with a grain of salt. But I'm just reporting what came out, and I'm not going to even try to interpret that result. But sometimes people will say something in response to a question that they might not say to you or me if we just sat down and talked to them. So I don't know. Anyway, that's one sign, just one little sign of a global identity in the South. Now I'm going to just pass around a couple of pictures to suggest a couple of other examples, though. And let me just tell you these first. This one is a picture of a man who's about 90 years old, who lives in Vicksburg, Mississippi, deep South. I could tell you a little bit about his life. He left home when he was 12. He worked for a white farmer who adopted him. And then he worked during the war for the Japanese and the Germans. Japanese were in concentration camps in California. Germans were some in prison camps in the USA. So anyway, he had a kind of global background, and he built a temple. And that's it that you see here. He built this temple to globalism. It's there in Vicksburg. So let me pass that around. So there's an example of somebody very old and black, but global in his temple. This one is a little more subtle, I guess, meaning it's maybe harder to interpret. But, and I'll pass it around as well. Well, on our campus at UNC, we have a Confederate veteran, as do many small towns all over the South. This one they call Silent Sam because he just sort of stands there, you know, with his rifle, protecting the place, I guess. Well, there is an organization which now has headquarters nearby in Hillsborough called Hare Krishna. Have any of you know about Hare Krishna? You do? Okay, great. What is it?
It's sort of like a cult, but it's like it's a religion.
Yeah.
It's like the Buddhism, isn't it?
Hinduism. Yep. You're both right. And the main Bible of Hare Krishna is called the Bhagavad Gita. And here's the story. I'm not going to go into detail because I know we don't have much time, but the story of the Bhagavad Gita is this. It's thousands of years old, and there were two families, and they were fighting each other, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And the hero of the Pandavas, whose name was Arjuna, he was sort of a knight, a warrior, did not want to fight his cousins. That was the other family, the Kauravas. And so on the eve of the battle, he said, I don't want to fight. But the god, Krishna, was driving a chariot, and Arjuna was in the chariot, and Krishna gave him a talking to, and he said, look, you don't have any choice. You are, you know, in India, classically, there are different castes, and one of them is the warrior caste. And he said, you're in the, it's called Kshatriya, you're in the Kshatriya, the warrior caste. You have to fight. It's your destiny. But fighting on the outside, you can be peaceful on the inside. Okay? And so you do that by being spiritually at peace. So he fought. And that has come down through the ages as a kind of guide to millions of Hindus, including Hare Krishna. So here was Hare Krishna, and they're on this stage, and they are reciting the story that I just told you. And here in the back is Silent Sam, the statue of the Confederate soldier. It's kind of weird, you know, that here would be two warrior traditions side by side. Of course, I don't think the Hare Krishna thought about this way. I mean, they didn't notice that it was Silent Sam, but I did, so I took a picture. There's Silent Sam, who, if you follow Robert E. Lee and that sort of thing, had a very similar philosophy to Arjuna, and that is, yes, you have to fight, but you can be at peace inside. Now, Robert E. Lee somewhat manifested that idea. I'm not going to push this too far, but anyway, it struck me as kind of ironic and sort of interesting that here, side by side, were two traditions. One which is global, and that's the Hinduist one, Hare Krishna, and one which is regional, and that's the Silent Sam. So here we are again, a local place with a global intrusion, you could say, or immigrated view, which is coming out of Hinduism. So let me just pass this around. So all this is just to say that, look, surveys aside, you can believe them or not believe them, there are signs here and there in the South of globalized identity, somewhat. Okay, I'm going to go on to my third result, which I call place to process. And in a way, it is the most difficult to grasp, but the most important and the most obvious, too. And all that I'm suggesting is that places that many of us have been accustomed to think of as old and static, staying the same. For example, farms, or maybe where your grandparents lived, or maybe where you live. And in some cases, I know that many of you have moved around, which I did when I was growing up, because my father was in the Army. He was on the way to D-Day, if you remember that from your history, Normandy invasion. So we moved all the time. But I lived with my grandmother for a while, and she lived on a farm, and that seemed like a stable place. Well, the South used to think of itself as that way. I have a quotation on your handout which comes from Roy Blunt, Jr., who said, "The South is a place the North just a direction. Well, that may have been true somewhat once upon a time, but I think we would all say that today even the South is a direction. It seems to be moving. I mean, for example, when I drove here this morning, I came on I-40 and then I cut on to 29. And, you know, on every side of me were trucks, and some of them were FedEx and UPS. And where are they going? Well, they're going to pick things up or deliver things that are coming from all over the world. And here's 40 and 29 and 85 that are just cutting through all of these so-called places, many of which we treasure. So, place is complicated. Incidentally, Chinquapin. How many of you have visited Chinquapin? Almost everybody. What is special about Chinquapin, among other things? Yeah.
It's a former plantation.
True. What else? Yes.
There's so many other places that are represented.
Exactly. And why is that? Why are all those other places represented there?
The owners of Chinquapin were obsessed with learning of different cultures and bringing it into their house to sort of give them a worldly view and make everyone see how affluent they are.
Yes. I noticed, by the way, apparently it's up for auction.
It went bankrupt. I think the story is the guy who owns it was dabbling in company money and stealing some.
Okay.
After going bankrupt, so it's up for rent now.
Yep. So there you go. There's a place with a history, and it's local, and it was, and still is, I would say, global for the reasons you mentioned, but it's changing. It's up for auction. By the way, do any of you know the writings of Randall Keenan? Randall Keenan? Randall Keenan is one of the most renowned black writers, and he's from next door to Chinquapin. He's from right here. Keenan, K-E-N-A-N. So things are changing. That's the only point. Why are they changing? Well, economics is one thing. Are any of you familiar with Walter Dalton, the lieutenant governor running for governor? Have you seen any of his ads? What did you see in his ads about becoming governor? Hmm? Yeah, and how to build an economy. Well, community colleges is the key thing. He says great schools make great jobs. And if you look at the ad, I saw an ad yesterday. He's actually at, I think not here, but another community college saying the importance of education. Well, all of that is about change. So, okay. So place is coming to be process. So, all right. So those are three suggestions about how the South is changing. And by the way, I wrote this book, and I just want to show it to you because it's kind of funny. The cover. What's on the cover? Can you see?
Confederate flag.
Right. Do you notice anything else about the Confederate flag?
Yeah, made in China.
Made in China. This is an actual Confederate flag. I went to the state fair, and I don't know if you've ever been to the what do they call it? The demolition derby. You know, where you crash car. Okay, and they were selling this Confederate flag, and I noticed that it said "Made in China," and I thought, okay, that's exactly what I want to talk about, is the fact that even the Confederacy is global. I mean, it's made in China. So that's the point of this. All right, that's all I'm going to say about the South. Now, I don't know, we only have, what, another 25 minutes? Yeah, so let me just add one little comparison very quickly, and let's turn on the images if we can. There we are. Okay, this is the first one that I showed you, and I already told you what it is. Muhammadiyah is an organization of 30 million people. It's found in Indonesia, which is the 4th largest country in the world after the USA. It's almost as big as we are. This is population, in population. And it is the largest Muslim country in the world. And they have created this organization called Muhammadiyah, which is this picture was, I took it 2 years ago, 2010, when they were having a Congress. And so that's why these women are standing there, and those pictures are up. This is the 100th year, 2012, of Muhammadiyah. And in that time, they have done quite an amazing amount of things. They have created about 50 universities. They've created 500 microcredit unions. The women of Muhammadiyah have done that. Microcredit meaning these are organizations for sharing capital in order to create enterprise. They have created about 300 hospitals. They have created thousands of K through 12 schools and the equivalent of community colleges. And they are Muslim, and they are somewhat fundamentalist. So I just want to quickly show you several images from Muhammadiyah. Shall we just run through those? This was their opening, and that's their founder, Kiai Haji Ahmad Dahlan. There we go, Coca-Cola, that's what I wanted. There they are with that. And there it is again, and let's just go on forward. And here's the first, all right, and this is a Korean woman, and this is their celebration of their 100th anniversary, and let's go on. Yep. And these are some friends who, one of whom actually, this person, graduated from the University of North Carolina. So she came all the way here. And here's the newly elected head of that organization, the man in the middle that everybody's trying to take a picture of, whose name is Samsudin. Okay, I think that's all of you. These are two places at opposite sides of the world, Indonesia and the USA, and they're so similar in so many ways, except Indonesia is predominantly Muslim and the USA is predominantly Christian. But all of that is tending to change in both places as a result of globalization. They're becoming a lot more alike. Okay, let me stop and see if you have comments and questions about any of this. Yeah.
I noticed for the posters that they had for the Muhammadiyah, that they were actually, you said that they're a Muslim country, which
Yes.
when I hear that, the first thing I think is they'd be using like Arabic lettering and everything, but they were using Romanized characters for
True.
everything.
Good point. That's correct. They do. They adopted Romanized characters, which means our type of alphabet, instead of Arabic. They do use Arabic in some places, like special ceremonies. But Indonesia was a colony of the Dutch, and from the Dutch they adopted Romanized writing. Good observation. Other questions or comments about any of this? Yes.
We're speaking about globalization here, but for me, one of the most difficult aspects of understanding globalization is defining it to start with. Do you have an active definition that you would use?
I have one word: connection. And that means economic interchange, internet interchange, personal interchange, so forth. By the way, globalization, as many of us know, it has its good side, its bad side. Its bad side for many of us is loss of jobs because they go abroad. Some economists claim that eventually we'll get those back. I hope so. Yes?
So are a lot of corporations getting their foot in?
Yes, the answer is yes. And for them, as for us, there's always a question of advantage and disadvantage. For example, you mentioned China. China is raping Indonesia's rainforest and using the wood because China needs wood, but it's destroying the environment. So that's not good. But on the other hand, places like China and Japan and others are creating a lot of jobs, and so the economy has actually improved in Indonesia, but the ecology has gotten worse and worse.
I think one of the big fears of all this is that all the economies merge. Our standard of living here is
Right.
seen as going down.
Yes.
Well, is it,
Could everybody hear? The fear is that as the economies of the world merge, our standard of living goes down and down.
well, a lot of fear, well, we're talking Western,
I think there's a lot of truth in that. So, but on the other hand, a lot of people are jobless, and and on the streets, jobless and homeless, and so there's some sort of balance between the affluence that many of us did experience and the poverty that many of us also now experience. Yes? Okay. The money part. Oh, by the way, I have a little motto. See if you agree with this. I just thought of it. Tao doesn't mean Dow. Dow, as you know, is the measurement for how's the stock market doing. Tao, T-A-O, is the Chinese view of a balanced life. So I think I'm going to write a book called Tao is Not Tao, but maybe before I die. Yes? Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that globalization, as far as the religion of Muslim, in respect to
That is a brilliant question. Well, the first image that I showed you, it had these two groups of women. One were the covered from head to foot. The other were dancers and bare-shouldered. And that is one example of that rift that actually, in the history of that country, women have traditionally had a great deal of freedom and sometimes leadership. And Islam has not wiped that out. I mentioned this organization called ISNA, which has created these 500 microcredit unions, but it has restrained women in some ways, like the dress code. So it's a kind of, there is a danger, in my opinion, I'll just be blunt about it, with Sharia, the Islamic law that does restrict women, and sometimes it's terrible. For example, adultery, you kill the person by stoning. I mean, that's kind of the extreme, but it is a true danger. Another horrible example is acid violence. Have you heard about that? It's the practice of a man throwing acid on the face of a woman and disfiguring her forever. Pretty horrible. So there are these dangers. So that's a negative, obviously, of globalization. I mean, do you want that to import that way of thinking? I think not. Yes?
Speaking on the Islamic
Yeah,
feminism.
and that is very important to take note of. On the one hand, there's the repression. On the other hand, there is the expression, especially by younger women, Muslims. This group is an example. Aisha also has a young Aisha movement, which is similar to what you've just said. So there's dynamism happening in all the religions: Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam. And therefore, I certainly don't want to just target and condemn any one of those, but I do think there is danger in when any of them become too restrictive. So just, by the way, I have 3 daughters, so I always worry about their future. These are really smart comments, and I'm open to any others. I think we have about 10 minutes to go. Yes? Okay, I have an opinion about that, but I am not expert on, I guess I have an opinion and a hope, which is the direction that we will move is away from oil dependency. And as I think we know pretty clearly, the days of oil, usable oil, are numbered, no matter where we get it. And then, as you say, then there are these alternatives, and some of them may have traps, like, okay, maybe one country has all the lithium. And then we talk about wind and sun and so forth, and those do seem to offer a huge possibility. But with those, care is needed also, like wind is sometimes extremely noisy for people living and all that. But I'm not expert. I don't, if others would like to chime in and answer her question, I'd be pleased.
Well, what I would say is that with the globalization and the people, we're starting to diverse. The reason why we take our Spanish classes
Right.
is to open up the window of communication.
True.
And this year.
Yes.
And I think
Well, okay, that's a really brilliant thought. And so how are we going to get there? Well, I don't know. I think there are formal organizations, like the United Nations, which are attempting to build an ecologically united world. There is a conference in Brazil, many of you probably know about it, that's happening this summer, and it is attempting, there was one in Copenhagen about 2 years ago, attempting to get unity of all the different countries, especially the big energy users like us and China. And then there are some small and maybe, well, sort of spiritual organizations. And I'll tell you one. Well, let's see. Let me just, it's called Ecozoic. Ecozoic, and strangely enough, they're actually having a conference this weekend in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And if anybody had any interest in it, not necessarily coming, but finding out what they discuss and what they learn, you could Google ecozoic. Well, here's what it is. Ecozoic was started in Greensboro by a priest whose name was Thomas Berry. He died, Thomas Berry. He died a year ago. He was 94. And his idea was this one, simple. During the last 150 years with the industrial epoch, we have destroyed a huge amount of the earth that has been built up over billions of years. And so we need to move to a new time when we renew instead of destroy. And he calls it ecozoic. And so he started this society in Greensboro, and it now has thousands of followers around the world. So that's another line of people who are trying to work together, and they are in many countries. China is one of the big places. So there are movements, attempts, but hard, because we've got so many interests, corporate interests, for example, and they're not all bad either. I mean, they have to, and some of them do, get into it. Progress Energy and Duke Energy are trying somewhat to work in this line. Yes?
As the world globalizes,
I think the answer is yes, but carefully. Amendment 1 is one of the proposals to change the Constitution of North Carolina. I'm not going to say yay or nay about it, but I think it's a very serious thing to change a Constitution, and the same with other laws. And so I suggest carefully, because we have a great Constitution, basically, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the idea of pluralism was not really present in the founding of the USA, for example. Would you agree? I mean, basically, the Bill of Rights and so forth was built for white property owners, which is great, but not enough. It is. I don't know if Mark would agree, and he doesn't have to step into that. Okay, very wise. Very wise not to. Anyway, there are lots of issues that, in fact, of course, need to be considered. But I think changing laws is a very tricky one. The thing about laws, and I'm not a lawyer, is that they can preserve freedom by giving a level playing field, potentially. And so, and one of the differences, I mean, around the world, globalization has terrific prospects, but I think we should be very careful about losing our democracy, losing our legal system, losing other structures and values and so forth that have stood us in good stead. We're a new nation, so to speak, but this nation has done very well, and I think it has to be very careful. And I'm not pushing for a conservative position necessarily, but I think there is something to be said for conserving as well as changing. So that's a cop-out. Thank you.